Hi there. This year, Bloodborne turns 10. Happy birthday, Bloodborne. I didn't make you a cake, but I made you a little video celebrating your music, which is just as much a masterpiece of horror as the game itself. While much has been said about the awe and craftsmanship of its individual tracks, there is just as much insight to be gained by looking at the score as a whole. Only then can we begin to tease out its easily missed patterns and arcane secrets, of which there are plenty. Equally important in understanding the Bloodborne score is dispelling the shroud of secrecy around the game's 6 composers, each of whom brings with them different textures and moods to the overall score. So let's get into it. I'm going to assume you have at least a passing familiarity with the game, but if you need a refresher, Bloodborne takes place in the plague-stricken streets of the Gothic quasi-Victorian era city of Yharnam. This plague is known as the Scourge of the Beast, turning its victims into werewolves. You are a hunter, and your purported goal is to cleanse these foul streets and to uncover the origins of this curious illness. And while the premise is simple, its execution is anything but. Bloodborne is a lot more than meets the eye. Before long, you'll find yourself wrapped up in some of the very best thematic and literal implementations of Lovecraftian cosmic horror I've ever witnessed. But I need to back up a bit. Bloodborne is From Software's 4th game in the Souls series. And when I say series here, I'm talking about the shared thematic and game design sensibilities that connect Bloodborne with From Software's prior titles, Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, and Dark Souls 2. The elements that comprise what is or isn't a Souls game are largely not of interest to this video, except for one, the music, or more specifically how they use music. Unlike most video games, the Souls games, specifically the 4 I listed above, are exceptionally measured and deliberate with their use of music, functioning less as a constant emotional narrator and more a sporadic anchor for your journey, used sparingly to highlight key moments. Like most games, music bookends the experience, playing on the main menu as you start the game, and over the credits as you finish it. It also plays in your home base or central hub, and most prominently, it plays when you are fighting the many grueling boss battles that have largely defined the series' reputation. But that's it. The rest of your journey, anytime you are actively exploring their meticulously detailed and crafted worlds, it is done so in silence. Well, not silence per se. The Souls soundscape is rarely quiet, thanks to best-in-class ambient sound design, blood-curdling growls, screeches and yelps, crackling flames, howling winds, and visceral attacks. All of which are so much clearer and easier to appreciate than in most video games, where sound design is typically forced to compete with the music. So the areas without music are far from silent, but they are certainly sonically devoid of the level of noise we are used to hearing in games, or even expect to hear. That void offers reprieve and introspection as you hurtle forward into the unknown. It also means that, by withholding music for large parts of the experience, it's that much more impactful when a scene is scored. These games are bereft of so much of the dialogue and HUD information that handholds players in other games, in part because they can use music as an extra tool, like an invisible amygdala hand that signposts you with crucial information. This place here? This place is safe and important. This guy here? Yeah, good luck with that. The impact of both those sequences is so much clearer and dramatic thanks to the contrast of the silent scenes that precede it, and those sorts of wow moments happen throughout the Souls games. This measured approach to game scoring was actually perfected by the progenitor of the Souls series. And no, I'm not talking about Kingsfield. I'm talking about the true spiritual predecessor to Demon's Souls, Ico, and more specifically, Shadow of the Colossus. Souls series creative director Hidetaka Miyazaki is quite open about the impact the game's Fumito Ueda and his team at Sony Japan had on establishing the tone and feel of his own games. From the ambiguously pockmarked storytelling, the delicate melancholy that permeates the environments, the overwhelming sense of loneliness, to the malaise-filled monstrous boss battles, Shadow of the Colossus largely wrote the book on the thematic and tonal core of all these games. And the same is true of their approach to music. For the vast majority of your time in these worlds, these are predominantly silent experiences, until they are not. Sonically, your time in the Forbidden Lands maps analogously to your time in Boletaria, Lordran, Drangleic, and, of course, Yharnam. The use of Shunsuke Kira's Demon Souls score and Motoi Sakuraba's Dark Souls score in their respective games follows the blueprint sketched out by Ko Otani's Shadow of the Colossus score. But while these two wonderful scores are tonally quite different from one another, they both share a lot of similar weaknesses from a sound production standpoint. Both employ a mixture of live and increasingly dated sounding virtual instruments, such as unconvincing brass, audio mixes too can sometimes feel very oppressive and claustrophobic, or in more technical terms, lacking in dynamic range and spaciousness, both of which can eventually lead to a fair bit of ear fatigue, especially in the case of Dark Souls' boss fights. These are pretty forgiving flaws though, especially when you consider these meaty scores were each composed by just one person. That's a tall ask, and I think Sakuraba and Kira did fantastic jobs considering the scope of their projects and the limitations of their tools and budget at the time. They nailed the format, codifying the Souls music template as we know it today. So while Bloodborne is working from an increasingly familiar framework, it doesn't really sound like the prior Souls games. Bloodborne, on the other hand, feels positively decadent. From the East, 3 From Software in-house composers. From the West, 2 Hollywood composers and a veteran game composer. And each of these composers brings with them their own set of skills and particularities, adding more texture to Bloodborne's musical canvas. Of course, the fear of this more shared approach to scoring is that it can be at the cost of a more singular, consistent vision. But that couldn't be further from the truth here. Across its entire score, Bloodborne is surprisingly cohesive and unified. And much of that is thanks to a decision early on in the production to limit the range of instruments the 6 composers could pull from. There are no woodwinds, no trumpets, no organ, and nearly no piano. That, and they are probably all forced to listen to Wojciech Kilar's score to Bram Stoker's Dracula one too many times. The Bloodborne score is unified, yet certainly not homogeneous. There are many differences and particularities to each of the 6 composers' styles, so without further ado, let's get into them and see what sets them apart from each other. I'll start with Ryan Amon, who is arguably the lead composer on the project, having scored 12 tracks, which is not only the most of any composer, but just 1 track short of being the same amount as the other 5 composers combined. Amon's role and importance in developing the Bloodborne sound cannot be understated, but just as interesting is the journey that brought him here. Prior to Bloodborne, he had very little experience working in the games industry, having only produced a small smattering of largely ambient tracks for 2014's Assassin's Creed Unity. He did have 2 Hollywood movies under his belt, but even those seem a bit like anomalies in his career. To this day, those are still the only 2 Hollywood movies he's scored. Up until this point in his career, Ryan Amon had scored a vast sum of reality TV scores, but his main body of work was trailer music. And by that I don't just mean music used in trailers, but also music for fictional trailers, music that sounds like music in a movie trailer. Trailer music as a genre. Under the name City of the Fallen, Amon would put out several albums of essentially concept music that told its own story, whether or not the work would be picked up for actual trailers later on. It's an interesting approach to songwriting that, at first blush, might be easy to dismiss music written for trailers as just some wing of a marketing department, devoid of artistic merit. But if you treat it more as a short-form vessel for conveying some sort of audiovisual idea or emotion, it holds a lot of strength. If done well, it can be just as fulfilling an experience for the viewer as a music video or a short film, the latter of which Amon would go on to score several of. It is easy for me to think of several trailers that, to me at least, ended up being better encapsulations of the tone of a project or more emotionally satisfying than the final project itself. And he was clearly onto something, because the story of how he got the gig scoring Neil Blomkamp's Elysium is almost the same as how he got the gig on Bloodborne. In both cases, the directors approached Amon after having heard his music cut to footage of their past works. But it wasn't Amon himself who had made these edits. These were organic fan edits that Blomkamp and Miyazaki both came across at some point, and each one saw something special in the pairing of Amon's sound and their own imagery. So to anyone watching this who makes their own fan edits and mashups of their favorite games and music, turns out y'all might have a lot more influence than I realized. I don't know which City of the Fallen track or tracks Miyazaki heard, but from exploring Amon's pre-Bloodborne era discography, you can hear echoes of his Bloodborne sound. In many of the pieces, there is an interplay of brooding, percussive orchestra and a serene female soloist. This particular arrangement is present in many of Amon's most important Bloodborne tracks, such as in the track Omen. This track doesn't actually play in-game, but was instead written for Bloodborne's original E3 2014 announcement trailer, and functioned as a sort of tone piece that would then help guide and influence the rest of the Bloodborne soundtrack. We have unsettling, airy violin layers, contrasted with deep solo instruments such as the cello or double bass. And of course, the female vocalist, which reinforces our isolation in this haunted, deeply oppressive world. We are also introduced to other music techniques vital to the Bloodborne score, such as the increasingly frantic ostinato patterns on the strings, or appropriately eldritch-sounding droning choir and violin tones. For what is ostensibly inconsequential trailer music, it does an admirable job bracing us for the Bloodborne experience. But it's the choir and solo vocalists that are at the core of his tracks' identities. They are present in all of his pieces and are used to convey a variety of themes and emotions. In The Night Unfurls, the main menu music, you can perfectly hear the way the soloist represents, and I quote Amon here, the frailty and loneliness of the mission while at the same time having the duality of peace and calm. This makes sense to me, though I think there is also, at times, something more sinister at play. Let's take a listen to Hunter's Dream, the game's Sanctuary hub. The vocalist here is largely unmoving, save long, sustained, calming notes. Perhaps disconcertingly calm. Here, the soloist is not the lead, but is instead complementing the viola, a possible stand-in for the soul of the hunter themselves. The viola introduces and repeats Bloodborne's most apparent leitmotif, which I will refer to as the hunter's motif. This four-note melody, somewhat evocative of the widely repeated 13th century Gregorian chant known as the Death Melody, or Dies Irae, is one of our few companions in Bloodborne, a moment of reprieve every time we return to the hunter's dream, which, unless you're doing a low-level run, is someplace you will return to constantly. But if the viola and its melody are stand-ins for the player, what does our soloist's vocal line, always intimately close by, represent exactly? Later on, at around the halfway mark of the game, you kill Rom, the vacuous spider. Yeah, that's her name. And from that point on, the truth of the world of Bloodborne becomes more apparent. Even the hunter's dream has changed. There are now crimson streaks across the sky, and the music sounds different. The ethereal voice no longer passively follows the viola, instead supplanting it. For most of the piece, it is now the voice singing the hunter's melody. The voice, this presence, is beginning to take control. Near the middle of the piece, we have a disruptive key change as the viola returns, however brief. Just long enough to repeat the passage once through before returning once again to the voice. The hunter is fighting back. The hunter is losing. The hunter's motif shows up one last time at the very, very end of the game, in the best of the game's three endings. Well, best is subjective, but I'm assuming you enjoy consuming umbilical cords and want to be reborn as a slug. Now, the sky is filled with black clouds, and an eldritch being descends from the moon. This is the Moon Presence, the creator of this entire dream world. In this ending, you fight back against the Moon Presence as a means to stave off its subsumption of you, the hunter. We hear the soloist repeating its deceptive, chameleonic claims of dominion over the hunter. But then, as the battle rages on, we also hear some of the entity's true voice. It's an entire choir repeating a single bar-length note, with the notes swiftly ascending on the second go-round. It is a terrifying chant that hauntingly captures the ethereal strangeness of Bloodborne's extra-dimensional entities known as the Great Ones. And just like how Bloodborne hides its Lovecraftian creatures and themes in plain sight, so too does this pattern, this eldritch, staggered, single-note choir chant with a clear E or Phi sound, show up throughout the score, hidden just beneath the surface. Let's listen to it in Ryan Ammon's own Queen of the Vile Bloods, followed by Celestial Emissary. Those are some of the most obvious examples, but there are variations of this sustained, sharp, single-note droning chant throughout the Bloodborne score. I counted about a dozen examples of it, all told. There is something very alien about this line's lack of melodic movement, especially compared to how Bloodborne typically uses the human voice as an instrument. The use of the choir, or at least a soloist, is rampant in almost every track in Bloodborne, and its implementation is wildly varied and mesmerizing, such as the layered and dissonant Latin harmonies of Watchers. Or male and female monosyllabic cries, hearkening back to the simpler choir chants of Demon Souls and Dark Souls, but with more intricately woven call and response patterns that create a sense of dizzying descent into madness, suitable for a man with a mind as cooked as Mikolash's. The list of creative examples is vast, but to me they all help to further contrast from the disconcerting single-note pattern I associate with the Great Ones. I think that lack of melodic movement is important here. It might symbolize our inability, as mere mortals, to really understand what it is they are saying, what they want from us, their true intentions. Speaking of voices and language, Ryan Ammon's Hail the Nightmare is worth singling out here. This track plays once you are whisked away by kidnappers to the Hypogean jail. This place is immediately shocking since, outside of boss battles and the Hunter's Dream, it's one of only 2 locations in the game where music plays. We hear a dangerously frightening choir calling out to a Great One, possibly to Kos, or some say Cosm. What is already a very foreboding piece becomes utterly horrifying at the climax as the choir calls out across a single sustained note, repeated twice. Is this perhaps an example of humanity trying to decipher and translate the true desires of the Great Ones? I love this piece, and it's a great example of the wonderful variety of Ryan Ammon's work on Bloodborne. 7 of his 12 contributions are played outside of boss battles, which grants him the opportunity to convey a much broader palette of emotions and tones than the requirements and expectations of combat music, which the other 5 composers are exclusively relegated to. And while these non-boss Ammon tracks are some of his most memorable and crucial to Bloodborne's own identity, his battle tracks are nothing to sneeze at either. Dark, cacophonous brass and percussion dominate his arrangement, with aggressive swirling strings and deeper masculine choirs complementing the action. Listen to the back half of The Hunter, when your first mandatory boss, a cautionary tale of what can happen when a hunter just like you has fully succumbed to the scourge of the beast. This piece is straight and to the point. The hunt is on. You are being hunted. Heck, you might even laugh at the morbid convenience of fighting him in a claustrophobic cemetery, should you live to tell the tale. That driving or marching rhythm, accentuating just about every beat, is a characteristic most of Ammon's battle tracks share. They are dark, loud, and rhythmically to the point. Both Queen of the Vilebloods and Moon Presence are equally unrelenting and would thematically fit the dramatic finale of a chase sequence at the climax of any great horror movie. We are operating on the basest levels of fight or flight, kill or be killed, likely both. But even within the field of boss battle tracks, Amon can still surprise. In both Celestial Emissary and Lullaby for Murgo, there are no signs of the frantic horror movie strings, or any driving percussion at all. It's their context that makes them so disconcerting. Ryan Amon's work across Bloodborne is stunningly evocative and the perfect encapsulation of the score's weird and varied tapestry. It feels almost impossible to imagine Bloodborne without Amon. But even though he scores the lion's share of Bloodborne, the other 5 composers are by no means riding on his coattails. Far from it. In fact, when I close my eyes and think back on Bloodborne, there's a different composer I always come back to first. Tsukasa Saito is one of the 3 From Software in-house composers who worked on Bloodborne. After Amon, he contributes the most tracks with 4 tracks. And I know that might seem like a paltry number, but I assure you his work is among the best of not just Bloodborne, but the entire Souls series. No one is more emblematic of the sound of From Software's entire body of work than Saito himself, having been one of the main composers at the company since 1998. His fingerprints can be found throughout all of From Software's greatest series. From the groovy 90s era electronica of Armored Core 2, or Kingsfield 4's uncannily haunting score, which at times veers into the realm of absolute masterpiece, such as in the game's main theme. Yeah, I still get goosebumps every time I hear that piece. And of course, his career continues on into From Software's post-Miyazaki renaissance, all the way up to Elden Ring, where he served as one of the game's primary composers. Yeah, that last one's a little obscure, sorry. But along the way, he scored Bloodborne, and there's no better place to start than what is likely your very first boss encounter, the Cleric Beast. Right from the get-go, we have a dramatically different use of choir from what we've heard so far. Ryan Amon typically used the human voice in 2 ways, either as a very delicate tool with a lot of auditory precision, such as the soloists in all of his non-battle tracks, or, while in battle, his choir, just like his rhythm section, is more to the point with the many voices singing the same note in tandem and all moving together with the central melody. The melodies themselves might be menacing or dissonant, but they are simple and cleanly conveyed and largely wordless. Saito's Cleric Beast, however, is a completely different beast. The choir passage that starts the piece is quite complex, with a much denser arrangement style. Your typical 32-person choir, which is what the orchestrator of Bloodborne employed, is broken up across 4 vocal ranges: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. In a smaller choir, or a barbershop quartet, you would give each voice type its own note so that when they came together, they would make a pleasing, harmonious chord. In a larger 32-person choir, however, you can produce the same effect, but obviously it'll have a lot more impact and fullness, since now you could potentially have up to 8 times more people singing each note. All 32 singers come together to make the same harmonious chord sound, but it's huge now. Or, more interestingly, you could subdivide those individual vocal ranges into more notes, leading to a much richer sound, or in the case of Bloodborne, a wildly more dissonant one. Here, the underlying melody is still discernible, as in, you can still hum it, but because of all that added definition, there's just so much more character and texture. In the Cleric Beast, that extra definition is used to add a lot more dissonance and tension to the phrasing. As the choir swells, we bring in an ostinato pattern on low strings. The next time through, the pattern is complemented by a second, more unnerving climbing melodic ostinato on violas and maybe violins. Take a good listen to that rising ostinato because we're going to come back to it soon. I promise it's important. After the second brass swell, we arrive at the central melody of the piece on violins, the one that the lone choir alluded to at the beginning. The melody is accompanied by the faster low strings from before, while also bringing in some classic horror movie violin stabs to accentuate the impact of the main melody, hitting in time with the choir. I love this track. The whole thing sounds like a nightmarish take on Carl Orff's Carmina Burana. Most impressive is just how dang catchy the whole thing is. That's not an adjective I frequently use to describe Souls music, but the way this track constantly returns to its main, highly infectious hook really helps the melody sink in. This gives it a structure akin to a pop song, which stands in stark contrast to the majority of Bloodborne's score, which is usually devoid of much internal repetition. Even From Software knew they had a winner with this one, since in the very first leaked trailer for the game, back when it was only known as Project Beast, they used a prototypical version of Cleric Beast to score the trailer. Oof, that frame rate sure was something. I guess that's another inspiration from Shadow of the Colossus. Saito must have been fuming when I called Cleric Beast akin to a pop song, because his second track, the equally fantastic Blood-Starved Beast, is a much stranger affair. The off-kilter 5/4 time signature evokes the erratic, unpredictable movement of the titular beast. The rhythmic patterning becomes more complex when the violins move to a matic ostinato and the percussion and brass begin to accent the first beat of every bar. It's such a cool, menacing groove, but does that violin ostinato sound familiar to you? Because to me it sounds a lot like the strings progression from Cleric Beast. Admittedly, the Blood-Starved Beast version is much faster, with a more jagged contour, and the jump from 3/4 to a 5/4 time signature also makes it sound unhinged, but the similarity is still striking, especially so if you think of the thematic connection between the two pieces. In both cases, we are fighting creatures that were once human, consumed and profoundly transformed by the scourge of the beast. In-game, you can take sedatives to placate that beasthood potential, dormant, or not so dormant, inside everyone injected with the old blood, i.e. the blood of the Great Ones. That includes you, the hunter, who was given that same blood transfusion at the very beginning of the game. The Cleric Beast, the Bloodstarved Beast, and even Vicar Amelia couldn't stop it in time. That frenetic fervor and that beast motif we hear in both of their themes, this repetitive ascending pattern feels like that beasthood rising and rising, bubbling towards the surface. The same is true of Father Gascoigne. In the second half of his battle, we see him finally succumbing to beasthood, and, on cue, Ryan Ammon's The Hunter brings in frantic violin ostinatos for this last phase of the fight. The use of musical motifs in Bloodborne is, like all things Souls, ambiguous and subjective. This beast motif, just like the Great Ones motif I highlighted earlier, is inferential but still devoid of concrete proof. It's nothing like how motifs are used in more orthodox musical storytelling traditions. Hey look, that's the one ring to rule them all. Better play the ring motif. Oh wow, our Lord and Savior Tifa Lockhart just showed up. Quick, put a reference to her theme in there. Side note, if you too find leitmotifs fascinating, I encourage you to check out just about any video on my channel. I can't get enough of this stuff. But you don't get that obvious payoff in Souls games. The beast motif I pointed out in Cleric Beast, in Bloodstarved Beast, and in The Hunter, are not the same. This wouldn't fly as a reference in a Final Fantasy game. But in Souls? The ambiguous, uncertain nature at the heart of these games is just so much more conducive to these sorts of logical leaps. The oft mythologized quote from Miyazaki on struggling to read foreign language novels as a child applies here too. In an old interview for Edge magazine, he discusses the allure of not fully understanding a story and how these sorts of knowledge gaps can create a sense of unknowable wonder and awe, which he tries to convey in his games. This leads to the player having to come to their own conclusions and interpretations as to what exactly is going on. That absence of the explicitly given truths applies beautifully to the music of Bloodborne and the possibilities of its leitmotifs. You start thinking, yeah, maybe there is something here. You begin to hear things and see patterns that may or may not be true. The sky and the cosmos are one. Hell yeah, man. You feel like the all-knowing, eyeball-laced Master Willem, even though there's a good chance you've gone off the deep end and are more of a Mikolash. But if you take that leap, there's so much more to gain from these scores. In Saito's Dark Beast, his third track, and also third with the word beast in it, you can sense there's something different about its titular character, Dark Beast Parl. The fight is just as frantic and chaotic as the prior Beast battles, but the music itself is much calmer and mournful than Cleric Beast or Bloodstarved Beast. We still hear the Beast motif in there, but unlike its dominant presence in his prior two tracks, here it shows up only in the piece's conclusion. Hinting that, yes, Parl is a beast, but there's more to it than that. It's a dark beast, whatever exactly that means. The game doesn't spell it out for us. There are several clues linking them to the ancient tragic land of Loran, but otherwise not much is known. The only conclusion we can glean from this battle, which is further reinforced by its unexpectedly sorrowful theme, is that there is much more to beasthood than we currently know. Across these three beastly tracks, we can see Saito's skill at expressing an impressive range of emotions within the narrow confines of what still needs to be music suitable for menacing boss battles. The intentional use of similar ostinato string patterns to evoke beasthood further solidifies their thematic and narrative cohesion. We'll return to Saito later on, but for now let's move on to our next composer, possibly our most interesting. Like Saito, Yuka Kitamura is another staple of the From Software sound team, having worked on the majority of the developer's titles since she joined the company over a decade ago. Like most new recruits, her initial compositions for the company are largely complementary to a game or series' pre-established tone, such as her handful of contributions to 2013's Armored Core 5, Verdict Day, and 2014's Dark Souls 2, which give us a taste of her brooding sound, although still somewhat dormant. This is in stark contrast to her work on Bloodborne the following year, which, while still only coming in at a lean 3 tracks, is an astounding step forward and a fantastic introduction to her unconventional sound that would dominate the following decade of From Software scores. If Tsukasa Saito's compositions are Bloodborne at its catchiest, its most immediately palpable, then Yuka Kitamura's work is Bloodborne at its most arcane. Deeply layered and textured with long meditative violin lines, choirs, and ethereal effects. That sense of momentum you frequently hear in the other 5 composers' scores, such as the driving percussion and brass of Amon, or the infectious, rousing melodic lines of Saito, are largely absent here. Instead, you are enveloped by something that thwarts that easy listenability. In Rom, the Vacuous Spider, the piece starts with a calm, warm female choir functioning as the track's foundation. Built upon it are all sorts of aleatoric textures, such as voices, struck prayer bowls, and meandering violin lines. These come in and out, seemingly at random, causing further disorientation as we struggle to figure out what exactly is going on, both in the music and in its particularly strange combat encounter. Kitamura is using all the same instruments as the other composers to create tension and horror, but she's largely sidestepping the louder, more tropes-laden effects, such as the psycho strings and bombastic clusters that Amon and Saito bask in. Even as the boss battle picks up, the point where other tracks might reach their frenzied crescendos, here things are still quite ethereal and graceful. Our main choir has opened up their vowels a bit and are singing a more discernible melody, though it's still free of much dramatic tension. We have percussive timpani accents, giving us a modicum of driving momentum, but even more fun is the cryptic whispers slowly being panned across the stereoscopic soundstage. As the choir and the piece itself reaches its deeply unsettling climax, we are still left with such subtle and ambiguous emotions. Listening to much of Kitamura's score is like trying to navigate the slippery logic of a dream, or better yet, a nightmare. The sensations are equal parts loud and quiet, distant yet right behind your back. Kitamura's Bloodborne score is Lovecraftian, and I can think of no better compliment to give it. Let's take a listen to Ebrietas, Daughter of the Cosmos, certainly my favorite piece in all of Bloodborne. Right from the beginning, Ebrietas disarms you into a sense of familiarity. There is nothing in the mix from an orchestration standpoint we haven't heard in dozens of tracks already by this late point in the game. We have a haunting, highly dissonant choir, swelling brass and staccato strings. On paper, there is little here that couldn't also describe the cleric beast. But even though the orchestration keeps it consistent, the underlying composition is much more singular. Ebrietas' theme best embodies the concept of non-repeating, through-composed music by constantly growing and never looking back. It isn't really building upon its prior ideas so much as it is always shedding itself and rebuilding itself. Every 20 to 30 seconds, it pivots to a completely different tone, to different musical keys and modes, but it does so with so much ease and grace that each of its turns never feels disjointed or out of place. Half a minute into the piece, it even moves to a major key, taking on a triumphant, perhaps cosmic tone that sounds unlike anything else in Bloodborne. Possibly the only acknowledgement of a major key in all of Bloodborne, come to think of it. It's beautiful, but you are given no time to dwell on it. Half a minute later, we've moved on, never to return. Ebrietas herself is terrifying to look at. She is one of the most awe-inspiring depictions of cosmic horror I have seen in any piece of media, but still, it isn't too hard to relate to her, since looking beyond the tentacles and the everything, we could still make out a relatively intact humanoid shape. She has legs, she has arms, and most importantly, she has a face. Look at her eyes, or at least look at what looks like eyes. The truth of what it actually is might be different, but in those eyes, we are given an important anchor to still somewhat process and relate to what we are seeing. The auditory equivalent of that visual anchor, of that comprehensible human-like face, is Kitamura's use of the choir. As the music glides along from one passage and mode to another, the choir is our one constant, front and center throughout the entire piece. And what a choir it is. Earlier I touched on how Bloodborne's composers frequently use a big 32-person choir, not just for more conventional 3-4 note stacking to make the human voice sound big and wide, but to add a lot more dissonant texture by really spreading out the voicing. And there is no better example of that than Ebrietas, Daughter of the Cosmos. They're using big, dissonant, 8-note voicing here, not just to convey primal fears like in Cleric Beast or Hail the Nightmare, but something greater. Ebrietas is Bloodborne's closest musical equivalent to Lovecraft's cosmic, non-Euclidean horrors, something just beyond our understanding of beauty and terror in equal measures. We're only halfway through our list of composers, but things should move a bit faster from this point on. The next 3 composers collectively contribute only 6 tracks in total, so while there isn't too much volume left to get through, we've still got some interesting ideas to cover. Okay, but how exactly do I follow Ebrietas? Oh, I know. Really, I can think of only one place to go from here. Michael Wanmacher is no stranger to video games, having scored a string of kid-friendly movie adaptations for the 6th generation of consoles, such as Madagascar, Over the Edge, and of course, Madagascar: Escape to Africa. But as seminal as those titles might be, he was likelier selected to work on Bloodborne because of his illustrious background in genre movies. The horror genre, specifically, which have been his bread and butter since the late 90s and continues on to this day. You might not recognize his name, but if you're a horror movie junkie, there's a good chance you've heard Wanmacher's work. But horror is a huge category with many subgenres. Slashers, vampires, comedy, supernatural, psychological. These are completely different styles of movies with completely different scoring traditions. Yet Wanmacher has carved a niche as someone able to navigate these many fields. From the metal-inspired intensity of Piranha 3D, to the frantic slasher energy of My Bloody Valentine 3D. know you're in for a rip-roaring good time when you're listening to a Wanmaker score. And yet, that high-octane energy is decidedly not the Wanmaker we got for Bloodborne. Instead, we got something much more delicate, atmospheric, and devoid of percussion. The Witch of Hemwick is the first track of his you'll hear in-game. We open on a call and response melody on cello and violin. Very lovely, and probably your biggest clue that you're listening to a Wanmaker track, since a similar cello and violin line prefaces all three of his Bloodborne tracks. Beyond that, big, open vowel choirs punctuate his pieces. In The Witch of Hemwick, it's primarily a male choir with an occasional female soloist. An arrangement very similar to Amon, whose style I imagine Wanmaker was instructed to emulate. The track doesn't really go anywhere, mostly basking in its moody atmosphere, or at least until you hit a certain threshold in the battle. Until you've reached a set damage threshold on the titular witch, the music will never advance past this section of the piece. So maybe now is a good opportunity to introduce another new concept that Bloodborne introduced to the Soul series: battle phases. Once you do enough damage to a boss, it triggers the next phase of the battle. This is true of most, if not all, boss battles in Bloodborne. Once you hit that HP threshold, which varies from one boss to the next, the boss gets more aggressive and has access to deadlier attacks. Consequentially, the music too introduces new passages, usually a more dramatic crescendo or coda. In the case of The Witch of Hemwick, the track expands out its loop point, introducing a slightly more manic section with more rhythmic low strings and frenzied violins. The choir too becomes louder, with the soloist replaced with a full female choir. All of which adds a lot more dynamism and variety to Bloodborne's boss battles, and is something that's become a Souls series staple from this point on. I mean, Shadow of the Colossus did it first, but hey, who's counting? But while these phase transitions are nothing unique to Wanmaker's tracks, something that is exclusive to him is his use of one of Western music's most ubiquitous instruments. In Micolash, Nightmare Host, Wanmaker lets a single low piano note repeatedly ring out. After the strings intro, a winding 16th note speed arpeggiated piano line comes in, becoming the dominant instrument for the entirety of the piece. It is a markedly different sound from anything else we've heard in Bloodborne, which up until this very late point in the game has been instrumentally very uniform. But this piano sticks out. Not in a bad way, but it certainly leads to some interesting questions. What is it about this fight that justifies such a unique instrument? The battle against Micolash is also quite unconventional. He doesn't attack you unless you've managed to corner him, and just cornering him is a puzzle in and of itself. It's closer to a game of cat and mouse than a typical Souls battle, so the piano might be there to signify that distinction. Or maybe the speedier piano lines are mostly there to evoke his hard-to-catch slipperiness. Impossible to say for sure, but I find it conducive to lore speculation. I would love to read your own thoughts on why the piano was used here, and here alone. Either way, it's cool to see some of the more ancillary composers on the project still provide unique and surprising elements to the Bloodborne score. And this is just as true of composer number 5, Chris Velasco. Outside of Tsukasa Saito, Velasco has been in the video games industry for the longest time, starting in the early 21st century as an additional composer on 2005's God of War, with many more contributions over the years for big, meaty Western action series like Darksiders, Mass Effect, and Borderlands. His work on 2012's ZombiU, with its tense moodiness and darker strings, might have been a factor in him getting the gig on Bloodborne. Velasco was a late addition to the Bloodborne sound team, meaning that, just like Wanmaker, when it came to his own work, he was able to draw on Amon and Tsukasa's compositions for inspiration. The benefit of this approach is that it allows his two contributions to the Bloodborne score to be much more referential to the other composer's work. And for a score whose use of motifs is deliberately ambiguous and with little repetition from one composer's work to another, Velasco's cross-pollination of Amon and Saito's motifs gives the score and its motifs more cohesion. In Terror, one of the boss themes that shows up in the Chalice dungeons, Velasco seems to invoke the Great One's motif, down to the same syllabic E sound. It seems quite clearly inspired by Amon's use of the motif across his own tracks, although in the case of Terror, the thematic or narrative implications are a little messier. As far as I could tell, Terror only gets used when fighting the watchdog of the Old Lords and the bloodletting beasts, neither of which I would call a great one, nor even akin. These are just very old beasts, right? So what gives? Is this Velasco being told to use elements from Amon's tracks without being informed of the hidden meaning of the motif? Or is this proof that there is no Great One's motif, really? If anything, the Great One's motif would have fit better in Velasco's second track, the fantastic Amygdala. There is some debate as to whether Amygdala should be considered a true Great One or not, but I don't think anyone is arguing that it's simply a mere beast. Yet, that's exactly what we'll find in its theme. It's a strange inclusion that further pokes holes into the game's already shaky theming foundation. Admittedly very shaky rebuttal I can offer is that maybe Velasco's two tracks were swapped for some reason in development, since thematically, associating the bloodletting beast with the beast motif and Amygdala with the Great One's motif makes a lot more sense. But personally, I'd prefer not use that possibility as a technical excuse. It's more fun if you take the game at its word, or at its sound. And if the scourge of the beast is born from the blood of the Great Ones, then, well, perhaps the two motifs aren't as mutually exclusive as they first appear. But I don't know. Thematically, it's all a bit messy, really. Either way, Amygdala and Terror are fine tracks that beautifully fit the tone of Bloodborne. Amygdala in particular is quite a standout to me. Beyond the aforementioned beast motif, the overall structure of the piece is equally mysterious and worth discussing. The track opens with a lovely solo viola with a similar nasal quality to the one employed in Hunter's Dream. This feels deliberate and shouldn't be confused with the more rampant use of solo cello and double bass throughout Bloodborne's score. In both cases, I think this otherwise unique viola here represents the hunter. The viola line is then filled out with accompanying strings and eventually a male choir. Next, the beast motif shows up. Man, this piece makes me think of a scribbled note left inside Bergenworth College. When the red moon hangs low, the line between man and beast is blurred, and when the great ones descend, a womb will be blessed with child. It made me wonder if the piece might be evoking such a ritual. We have the man and the beast, perhaps blurred, and as the track reaches its first climax, we hear the introduction of an ethereal female choir with a slowly descending melody. From that point on, the two choirs are blended together, blessed with child, as we return to the melody that opened the piece, now with renewed intensity. Was this all deliberate associations made by the composer? I doubt it. But any piece that provokes so much theorizing is a testament to Velasco's skill as a dynamic composer. Kudos to him. And that leaves us with one last composer, our biggest enigma yet. Nobuyoshi Suzuki completes the trio of in-house From Software composers on Bloodborne. His sole contribution, The One Reborn, might not have the impactful catchiness of a Saito piece, nor the rich, cosmic texturing of a Kitamura piece, but it's still a fun, brooding track. It starts with a pulsing bass drum that builds and builds. The One Reborn itself is a failed experiment at turning humans into great ones, but ultimately creating an abomination of dubious intelligence and/or merit. The music complements the tragic story of the creature with its menacing downward progression that repeats throughout the track, growing louder and angrier as it fills with rage. The track also has something similar to the beast motif, although I expect this is likelier coincidental than intentional. Bloodborne appears to be Suzuki's first contribution to a video game score, having started work at From Software a couple years before its release. He is also credited as a sound designer, where I assume he spent most of his time on the project. But while the inclusion of this young, unknown composer in the Bloodborne score is seemingly easy to dismiss, I think the importance of giving him an opportunity to spread his wings, to take a stab at scoring in the big leagues, is of utmost importance. For without it, I don't know if he would have had the chance to go on and compose what might just be one of the best pieces of music in a From Software game. But that's a story for another time. And with that, we've covered all 6 composers that collectively form the Bloodborne sound and experience. But beyond just them, there's another reason the Bloodborne score can sound so cohesive, so consistently and uniformly Bloodborne, even though the music originates from 6 different composers with, as we've just heard, fairly different compositional styles. Like the influence of Odin, the formless Great One, Bloodborne's sound is marked and shaped by invisible guiding hands that further elevate the score. The first hand belongs to Peter Scaturo, the score's producer, and being a producer, Scaturo's role is exceptionally broad. From developing the exact criteria that make up Bloodborne's Gothic Victorian sound, to helping the composers split across 2 different continents and 2 different languages to effectively communicate, the producer is tasked with wearing many, many hats. The other invisible guiding hand belongs to Penka Kunava. Kunava is Bloodborne's orchestrator and functions as the connective tissue that allows the composer's disparate voices to become one. Kunava has been a composer and orchestrator for Hollywood and video games for nearly 2 decades, and her importance on Bloodborne cannot be overstated. While less flashy a title than that of composer or arranger, the orchestrator still plays a crucial role in the overall sound of a score. It's their role to take the composer's track mock-ups and translate the MIDI sequenced arrangements into something real-life instruments can actually play. And while you might think this is just a case of one-to-one mapping of virtual instruments to real instruments, in practice it requires substantially more artistry. The real Bloodborne Symphonic Orchestra is comprised of 12 first violins, 10 second violins, 8 viola, 8 cello, 6 bass, 6 horns, 4 trombones, 1 cimbasso, the 32 members of the choir we covered earlier, and for the percussion we have timpani and chimes. While this seems like a lot, it is infinitely more finite than what the composers, working in their digital audio workstations, have to compose with. There are no real limits to the amounts of tracks or instruments you can include in your mix, nor is it important if a melody line is too fast for human hands to play, or if it's even in the right register of a specific instrument. In a digital audio workstation, you are largely beholden to one single rule, whether it sounds good or not. But a real orchestra has real boundaries and a whole slew of logistical limitations, and making sense of all of that is the domain of the orchestrator. It's the orchestrator's job to translate the infinite into the finite. I highly, highly recommend the online talk that the Bloodborne music producer and orchestrators gave at the Game Developers Conference back in 2016, which demystifies some of the issues that arise when moving something from the virtual world to the real. In particular, I appreciated their seemingly paradoxical example of how adding sound in the virtual space can directly mean subtracting sound for a live orchestra.
And another thing to bear in mind is that with sampled instrumental sections, when we add another note to the string section, we're essentially adding another 10, 14, 16 players. And that's really beefing up the sound. With real orchestra, of course, when you ask them to divide, you're halving the number of people on each note. Although it can sometimes seem counterintuitive coming from MIDI, Divisi can actually make a string section more delicate and airy, especially at low dynamics. Not that that was a thing that happened that much in Bloodborne.
The orchestrator's role is somewhat thankless, and there are probably several of you wondering, if you have to make so many concessions and compromises to your original virtual music idea, why even bother going through the hassle of orchestrating it? Why not just stick to virtual instruments? Surely you'd save a buck or two along the way. Bloodborne was scored across several sessions at London's Air Studio and Abbey Road Studio. You need Sony money to get away with an exorbitantly costly endeavor like that. So why bother going through all the effort of a live orchestration? It depends on the game, but in the case of Bloodborne, I think the quality of the score speaks for itself. Especially when compared to the virtual and live arrangements of Demon's Souls, Dark Souls 1, 2, and even Dark Souls 3, which came out after Bloodborne, but didn't have that Sony money for it to get the full orchestral treatment. Those are all wonderful scores, but they are let down by frequently unconvincing brass, less expressive violin solos, and stiffer choirs, all of which sound worse and worse with age as modern virtual instrument libraries continue to improve. I don't know if you've heard of Shadow of the Colossus, but that game also got the Sony-backed full orchestration treatment and is one of the main reasons that score still sounds timeless, even though it came out a generation before Demon's Souls and Dark Souls. There is a richness and dynamism to live recordings that I am yet to hear even the very best virtual orchestration come even close to matching. And while it's tempting to separate the composer's work and the orchestrator's work as art versus craft, in practice, these are much more intrinsically linked than they might first appear. The sky and the cosmos are one. So yeah, I think orchestration and the orchestrator's role are worth it. I want to leave you with one last track before we blow out the candles on our little Bloodborne birthday party. Depending on which ending you get, Bloodborne has up to 3 potential final bosses. Thematically, Gehrman is the most important, being by far the hardest of the 3 and emotionally the most fraught and meaningful. Unlike Murgo's wet nurse and the moon presence, Gehrman has been your companion and your guidance for the entire game. The theme of his battle, Tsukasa Saito's The First Hunter, is a melancholic piece free of the horrors and tensions that have plagued the vast majority of the boss themes up until now. The First Hunter eschews the brass and percussion that dominate so much of the score, showcasing exclusively the strings playing long, expressive legatos. Our opening verse melody line might sound familiar to you. It's very similar to the main passage from Chris Velasco's Amygdala track. Not identical, but unlikely to be a coincidence. I theorized earlier that the use of the solo viola and amygdala might represent the hunter, since we've already made a connection between the solo viola and the hunter in Ammon's Hunter's Dream. So it would make sense for this to show up here too, in the theme of the first hunter. But here the melody isn't repeated, but instead builds and swells into Bloodborne's most beautiful passage. Wow. From the mournful vibrato on everything to the subdued melody line, not on the violins but on the more somber cellos, there's just so much sentimental impact here. Tugging at the heartstrings at the last minute. It's admittedly a familiar approach for the Souls series. Motoi Sakuraba's tearful piano-arranged final battle in Dark Souls 1 is just as much a tonal curveball as the first hunter. This subdued, mournful approach is also how Shadow of the Colossus scores its final boss, but I think I've said more than enough about that game. For this video at least. Anyhow, the piece then returns to the prior section, but this time the first hunter's melody is simply implied by the contour of the moving chords. Our next swell brings us to a new central melody, made all the more pronounced by the violins taking the lead for the first time. The progression leads back into our lovely B section from before, punctuated by a drum hit, followed by slightly more rhythmic low strings. In a game filled with so much horror, this is a beautiful fight. But a hunter is a hunter, even in a dream. Both hunters are fighting to let the other one wake up and to finally be free of this nightmare. The hunter's motif repeats again, this time going from viola to violin, as if the knowledge and role has been passed on to someone younger, ourselves. As Gehrman approaches death, the second phase of the battle begins, bringing with it a large choir, singing the preceding violin passage. It's a final funeral rite, and a wonderful end to our time in Bloodborne. Let's leave it there. Many, many thanks to everyone watching and listening, and also to those who can support my work on Patreon. These videos are a long labor of love, and the only way I can justify the massive time commitment is thanks to your generous contributions. One of my Patreon perks is access to the spreadsheets I make to help me develop these videos. These are granular spreadsheets that cover each piece of music from whatever game I'm discussing. And this is true of Bloodborne as well. My Composer tier patrons now have access to my Bloodborne spreadsheet, which goes into more detail on the usage of leitmotifs in Bloodborne, as well as all the little details I found that I couldn't quite fit into this video. If you're looking for more videos on Bloodborne's music, I've got some recommendations. Of course, all your favorite music analysis channels have done fantastic jobs covering Bloodborne extensively over the years, but there are a few more that seem to have largely slipped under the radar that are equally worth your time. The gaming bard and Robert Rosenbrook took much closer looks at the score's underlying music theory to tease out interesting correlations to the game's lore, while Francesco Di Fortunato does a fantastic job contextualizing the score and its techniques within the larger history of Western music traditions. And lastly, I'd like to recommend Sir Ven's video, Songs of Madness, where he essentially walks you through the entire soundtrack, one piece at a time. I discovered this video about halfway through writing the script for my video here, and was elated to hear I wasn't the only one associating thematic connections to specific motifs. My idea of a Great Ones theme was initially more of a blood theme, but Sir Ven's video pointed me towards the light. All of these videos are worth your time, and I recommend you add them to your watch list. With my playtime now approaching 300 hours, it seems I can never get enough of Bloodborne. It's a game I'd love to revisit on this channel again someday, although it's hard to imagine finding much else to say I haven't already covered in this video. Unless... That's right. You were at my side all along. My true mentor, my guiding moonlight. The Sublime DLC for Bloodborne, The Old Hunters, will turn 10 in November of this year. If this video does well enough for me, I would gladly rejoin the hunt one last time to cover the Old Hunters soundtrack, which I largely consider to be as good, if not better, than the main game score. So I would be truly grateful if you could help this video here find an audience by sharing it widely. Tell your friends, tell your families, tell the moon presence, or whichever great one happens to be lurking over your shoulder. Alright, that's it for today. More Final Fantasy VII Rebirth music analysis coming in the next couple weeks. Until then, take care. Bye.